Visual C Sharp 2010 Express Edition allows you to create two different types of databases that you can add to your existing applications. The first one, as you can see here in the Add New Item dialog, is a local database. The description over here to the right says that a local database is an empty SQL Server Compact Edition database for local data. If we look down just a few items later in that dialog, there's also a service-based database, and it describes this as an empty SQL Server database for service-based data access. Kind of cryptic and self-referential there. But in practical terms, what's the difference between these two types of databases? And more importantly, which one should you be using for your applications? That's the topic of this video. In fact, this video is really just a summary of a white paper that was originally written by Steve Lasker from Microsoft that details the difference between the two editions of SQL Server that we'll be discussing in this video. You can find the white paper at the URL that you should see on your screen right now, or you can search for it using the title or a number of keywords. The title of the white paper is Choosing Between SQL Server 2005 Compact Edition and SQL Server 2005 Express Edition. So yes, I know that the white paper was written in 2006 and it references the previous version of SQL Server. However, nothing significant has changed in the 2008 version of either editions that would modify or change anything that we are discussing in this video. At least from the perspective of this topic matter. And so all the ideas expressed in that white paper should still be valid. So what's the difference between a local database and a service database? Well, I think it would help if we began with a couple of scenarios. And by the way, this video is going to be almost slides only. You might even prefer just to read either the original white paper, or I'll go ahead and put out the entire script for this video if you would prefer to read this. But I'm going to go ahead and read from it and try to maybe make a point or two along the way. So we'll start with a couple of scenarios. We'll talk about 4 scenarios. The first scenario is that of an application that runs on a Windows device, such as a Windows CE smartphone or a tablet PC. The application needs to store data in a structured way in a local repository of some sort, and it stays on that particular device. That's the first scenario. Second scenario is that of a distributed application on a company network. So each employee runs an application and the data has to be shared amongst all the employees. So the application also supports a web-based interface so that the partners to that organization and other interested third parties can access some of the data via the internet. Each internal end user is running a client application on their workstation. The database lives on a database server on a cluster of computers, but it's accessible to the client applications via remote call across the network. And also it's available to a cluster of web servers. They also access the database servers through the network. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario is a single Windows application that's running on a single laptop or desktop computer. In this scenario, kind of like the outside salesperson, the user can operate the application for days or weeks at a time without ever connecting to the internet. But they can optionally sync the data with a central database from time to time. The fourth scenario is that of a single Windows application running on a single desktop. The data is private to the current user. Now, there could be multiple people using the same computer, like in a household. They each have their own login and so forth. And so they each can save their own private version of the data on that computer, but each user in the household cannot see the data that has been saved by each specific user. So as you can see, the 4 scenarios that we have there, in the first 2 scenarios, there's a clear distinction between a data store that's embedded in an application that's intended to be used for a single user versus a client-server data store that is fundamentally shared amongst many users. The third and the fourth scenarios that we described, they blur that distinction just a little bit. And so that's where really the difference comes in and where we want to focus our conversation for today. The first scenario is clearly a job for SQL Server Compact Edition. It was created years ago for this very purpose. It's to be used by embedded devices. It's a file-based data store that's loaded into the application's memory context as requests are being made for data. So it must live in the same physical location as the application that is actually consuming it. In other words, it has to live on the same computer, no network access. The second scenario is clearly a job for either SQL Server Express Edition or probably more likely, the other editions of SQL Server. There are a number of editions of SQL Server, including the Express Edition, but also Workgroup, Standard, Enterprise, and Data Center. These editions are all service-based, meaning that a service listens on a network port for requests, and then it services potentially dozens or hundreds of concurrent requests from applications and from users. While the data is saved ultimately to disk, the clients, whether they're users or applications, don't get direct access to the disk. Instead, they have to make requests for the data via some programmatic service layer that acts as the gatekeeper. So they're making their requests to a service, and that service on their behalf goes to the disk and retrieves the data for them. The service makes sure that the application or the user making the request has the proper permissions to do so. It also has features designed to manage and maintain data for many users, not just one user. And so that's the fundamental difference between SQL Server Compact Edition and SQL Server Express Edition. The Compact Edition is file-based. It's intended to be consumed by a single process and loaded into that process's memory space. SQL Server Express Edition and those other server editions, they offer a service, and any application that wants to use the data has to interact with that service. The data is served what's called out of process, or in other words, it's a separate program that's answering the requests by bundling up all the data and delivering it in a message, as opposed to giving direct access to the file or the memory where that data is stored. And so this is the fundamental difference between the two database types, and it accounts for the difference in the features that are offered by each. I have a chart that I'll post up in just a moment, but what about those last two scenarios where it seems like there's some connectivity and some autonomy shared within the same application? Well, this is where you, the developer, have some decisions to make. And so the rest of this video will help you to try to make a good choice in that regard. So here's the chart that you should see on screen right now. It just comes from that white paper that I talked about a moment ago. It nicely shows a side-by-side feature breakdown of the two editions, and there are some notable differences. First of all, let's talk about data access and programmability. Notice that the Compact Edition doesn't support those programmable elements like stored procedures, for example. There's a couple of reasons for this. Stored procedures make a lot of sense when you're working with many users in a shared database setting, because administrators can control access to certain parts of the database by permitting certain users to use certain stored procedures, like we talked about a day or two or earlier in today's video lesson. However, when an application is targeted for use by a single user, that aspect of security is not quite as important anymore. The user can only hurt himself by doing something that he shouldn't be doing with the data. Also, we said previously that stored procedures do provide some performance benefit. However, in a desktop application where the entire database is devoted to a single user, that becomes less of an issue. The entire computer's resources can be devoted to any and all requests of the data by the client application. I'm really oversimplifying here. Hopefully, however, you can see the reasons for stored procedure that make sense in a shared database environment, make less sense, and create more overhead in a file-based environment. Another distinction between the two databases is the way that client applications connect to them. And while I've already alluded to this, allow me to elaborate on this just a little bit. When a client application opens a Compact Edition database, the file is locked and loaded into the client application's process and memory space. So suppose the client application wants to sift through a number of records, or allow the user to make changes to each row, and this process could take minutes or hours. Well, that's no problem. The scenario as described as what we would call connected all the time, potentially. Or in other words, the connection to the database is opened and it remains open as long as the application deems necessary. Since no other application can, or rather should, be opening up the file, providing controls over concurrent usage of the file is really not an issue. However, in a service-based scenario, the story is quite different. Remember, in a service-based database, the service is listening for requests from potentially dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of concurrent clients. If every one of those applications needed to keep a live, open connection to a table of data, that would block all other users from making reads on the data or making changes to the data. So blocking becomes an issue. So concurrent use of the data, or rather concurrency of use of the data, becomes a huge issue in a service-based database. Ideally, each application would make a brief request, such as, give me all customer records, or at least the first 25 of them so I can display them to my user. The service then fulfills that request, sending that data and only that data to the client application. The client application receives that data and then disconnects from the database. Now, if the client application needs to modify one of the rows of the data that were returned back, then it has to establish a new connection to the database service and give it that request. This scenario is described as disconnected, or in other words, the connection to the database is open and closed frequently by each application or each user that needs something from the database service. And there are other issues with regards to concurrency that are a bit more advanced. And we talk about those in our ADO.NET series. That might be an archive series by this point. But we'll also want to deal with that when we talk about the entity framework and link to entities. So don't worry about all the particulars of concurrent usage of database data. We'll worry about all the particulars of that and the challenges therein at some future point in time. But just rest assured that somebody's already put a lot of thought into all this, and there are some simple prescriptions for you, the software developer, to follow when you get to that point in your software development. All right, the next topic that we want to look at in this chart is that of security. The way that each database type implements security is a bit different, again based on how it's intended to be used. So the white paper that I referenced makes the point that both Compact Edition and the Express Editions are secure platforms. However, it's simply the way in which the data is secured is a bit different between the two. Both databases rely on the underlying security mechanisms that are already built into Windows. So if a user shares his administrative Windows account with 1,000 of his closest friends, then all bets are off. If somebody can get into the administrator account or the user's account on a given computer, then he can get at all the underlying data files. This is referred to as physical security and can only be addressed using basic best practices like locking a workstation when it's not in use. Since the Compact Edition is just a file, anybody who has access to the file could open it and edit it using free tools like MS Query, for example. However, the Compact Edition allows you to encrypt and password protect the entire file, and you would simply save the password in the code of the application that you build, or in a resource file or something like that. The Express Edition stores its data in a file with an MDB file extension. However, as the white paper puts it, it applies security at the service boundary. So there's no encryption or password for the file itself per se. And while it's not easy, it's totally possible for a knowledgeable hacker to grab the underlying data out of the file and open it using their own instance of SQL Server Express Edition and peruse the data. Since the Express Edition applies security at the service boundary, it uses the same security that's offered in the other editions. It uses users and groups and roles and permissions and so on. It's more concerned with making sure that a user, John Smith, in accounting can only access certain tables and perform certain actions on them. Again, this is what you would expect when you have potentially multiple people accessing the same database. Do all users need complete and total access to all database objects? Well, most likely not. So you have a fine-grained control as a developer or a database administrator on who can do what in the database. Moving beyond the basics, there's also a notion that a single computer can have multiple users. So what happens in that scenario? In that case, consider the compact edition first of all. Each user has a private file structure where private data is stored. That's just a given when you use Windows. It's different on a per operating system basis, but a developer would need to account for some partitioning system whereby each user gets their own private data, a local copy of the database that prevents any other user from seeing that data. Now, in the case of the Express Edition, the developers created something new called user instances, which are conceptually the same as this file partitioning system in the compact edition databases, where each individual gets their own private version of the database, but is implemented differently internally because ultimately a service is still responsible for serving up the right data regardless of where it's stored. So we covered the topic of user instances in an older video series regarding SQL Server Express Edition. I believe it's hosted both here on LearnVisualStudio.net and on TrainingSpot.com. So I'm not going to take the time to elaborate on how all that works at the moment. I would just refer you to those videos on LVS. But to answer that question, while there are some gotchas with both routes, you can still provide data security when accounting for multiple users on the same computer so that they don't share information back and forth between two users on the same computer. All right. The final difference I want to point out is that of deployment. There's a large difference in how the two databases are deployed to end users. Deploying a compact edition database file is extremely simple. You just need to ensure that all the proper DLLs, the assemblies, .NET assemblies, are included in the installation package whenever you create your application. We haven't talked about that yet. We'll get to it later. Since all the files are deployed in a folder, including the .NET assembly DLLs and the database file itself, there's no real concerns about permissions required by the user on their own machine. You can use either of Microsoft's deployment options, the easy click once technology, or the more advanced, more complicated MSI, or rather Microsoft Installer technology. And again, we're going to talk about those at a later date about how to actually deploy your applications to end users. Deploying a SQL Server Express Edition database onto a user's machine is quite a bit different. First, the installation is quite large. It adds 50 plus megabytes to the file installation. Since SQL Server needs to be installed as a Windows service and can only be installed by a user that has administrator privileges on the target machine, then you're limited on the types of installation programs that you can actually create. You're going to have to only use an MSI or that Microsoft Installer type of installation for SQL Server Express Edition database types. I don't expect you to know why that's significant. Just remember this. It's a lot easier getting the Compact Edition database onto a user's machine than getting the Express Edition database onto a user's machine. Not impossible, it's just easier and there are fewer deployment headaches. So let me do this as I wrap up the video. Let me give you a few guidelines. Keep in mind that only you know the application that you're building, and you may come to different conclusions based on your particular needs. I'm just giving you some basic thought, or rather maybe a design pattern for now, and you can build on that based on what you need for your particular application or organization. So if you're going to build a desktop application that never needs to communicate with any other computer, then you may want to consider the Compact Edition. If you're going to build a desktop application and you'd like to take advantage of stored procedures, or if you plan on working primarily in an enterprise, then you should be using the Express Edition. If you think your desktop application might need to scale someday to support multiple concurrent users, then go ahead and start off by using the Express Edition. If you have a scenario where you need the desktop application to occasionally sync up with a centralized database store, then use the Compact Edition on the client and SQL Server Standard, Enterprise, or Data Center on the server. If you're going to build a website using ASP.NET, eventually, then use the Express Edition. Of course, now we're way off topic. We're going to get to web applications in the next core series of videos. But to wrap up, as you can see, both databases have their role, and they have features that accommodate that role. So that allows you to choose, and I would encourage you to choose wisely. So next up in the next video, we're going to take a brief overview of the different ways that you can access the code in your SQL Server Express Edition databases. So in other words, we're going to do what we promised earlier. How do you marry up what you write in C# in your .NET applications and what you wrote in Transact SQL in your SQL Server Express Edition or Compact Edition, well, specifically Express Edition, because we're going to be talking about stored procedures as well. And then we're going to go into all the myriad ways that you can access data from your application. So at any rate, that will hopefully spawn a whole new exciting conversation for you, hopefully an eye-opener. See you in the next video. Thank you.